I'm about sick again. Welcome to the sixth episode of Collective Utopia. Before I start and jump right into the next chapter, I just wanted to remind you, if you're here for the first time, that in the very first episode I give for about 15-20 minutes a deeper insight into the project of what the basic ideas are, how the structure is, and how you can get involved. So I suggest you to go back to the very first episode if you want to have an overview about what this is all about. But for now, I jump right into the sixth chapter, which is a bit a longer one this time, which was written on October the 7th of 2021, so more than a year ago. Paradox of the hurried acceleration of everyday life, which at the same time cements the feeling of a leaden lack of alternatives. With my breakfast in hand, I open the back door to the park and make my way to the front terraces. As I pass between the trees and shrubs, the first glimpses open up to me and it takes my breath away. A vast glistening sky opens up to me. Looking down on the landscape, half my field of vision is filled with bright light. Loose clouds and fog let the sunlight through, break it and make the sun rays visible. Starting from the fireball, powerful rays of light are drawn into the firmament in all directions, illuminating the surface of the sea in a silvery, powerful glow. The landscape behind it is shrouded in mist and shadowy, a dreamlike sight. I want to absorb the image and look towards the lights, the source of life. But the radiance of the sun is so strong that my eyes have to avert their gaze. A power and beauty that hurts my visual organs. Again and again, away from the sun, my gaze is forced to the outer edges of the halo of rays. The landscape in the direction of the east is immersed in this misty light, which again seems almost artificial because of dimmed shadows, like a miniature landscape, almost close enough to touch. Today it seems more like the scenery of a puppet stage. When I look past the cone of rays in the other direction, I see waves coming from the west pushing into the bay. At this point, on the northern coast of Sicily, the sea is normally very calm, sometimes as smooth as glass. The waves are witnesses and offshoots of a storm or tempest elsewhere, perhaps hundreds of kilometers away. From the usual quiet basic roar of the sea, refractions of individual waves peel out in slow rhythm before the sound merges again into the constant whispering of the sea. Individual gusts of wind complement the diverse sequences of different timbres of an archaic noise, a soundscape that has accompanied the landscape here for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. This wild, pristine nature, interspersed only with traces of human civilization in form of a few houses and a road, simply exists here for an incredibly long time, always makes me think about the finiteness of our human life in our time. Our historical moment today, in the 20s of the 21st century, is such a fleeting one in the vast timelines of evolution and the world. Yet we experience our world, our evolved system as a static, unchangeable, almost as if set in stone. It is paradoxical, but perhaps no other basic feeling saturates our time more than the feeling of the lack of alternatives, the paralyzing feeling of the unchangeability of things. This feeling is paradoxical in several respects. Firstly, our time is the fastest ever. Everything changes permanently. Stories and headlines are rushed through the news cycle. Technological innovations are fired up. The whole world is covered with an infrastructure at enormous expense, and the universe is bombarded with satellites so that we have even faster internet available everywhere. Billions of people around the world are staring at their cell phones at this very moment, flicking from one piece of content to the next, skimming a few headlines, swiping from one photo to the next on Instagram in the hunt for a visual thrill, or watching a TikTok video that, in order to withstand the rapidly diminishing attention, has to show its entire content compressed into a few seconds. A tremendously accelerated staccato of stimuli, a breathless succession of news trends that go viral in the hashtag mania. However, this constant barrage of new stimuli seems to wear out so quickly that we feel like we're trapped in a continuous loop of the same old thing, like we're stuck in a static world. This paradigm of the alleged lack of alternatives is also paradoxical because, with a little distance, if one moves away from our time a bit and looks into the past, into the history of mankind, one has to realize that nothing made by man has ever been lasting. For example, everything is time-bound, exists for a time and passes away again. The one that comes afterwards was the alternative that has emerged from the previous status quo. There is and always comes an alternative. Yes, there is no alternative to an alternative. But this forgetfulness of history today is also a characteristic of our time. We don't know our own cultural history anymore. It doesn't interest us either. We find it boring. It lacks the crass appeal and quick kick. Classical music, for example, is for many people today a style of rock music from the 70s of the 20th century. A time horizon that extends beyond one's own lifespan is foreign to many people today. The third paradoxical aspect of today's perceived lack of alternatives is probably the fact that we all cling to the status quo almost desperately. Yes, perhaps precisely out of the awareness and certainty that today we must or would have to change everything, and indeed everything, globally and radically. The clear signs of this necessity are reflected to us today daily in the media, and at the same time this consciousness of the necessity of a radical change is suppressed today in an enormous psychological work of collective repression. According to a recent study, 3 out of 4 children are afraid of the future. Another indication that we all basically know what's going on. Today, we no longer have to grab anyone by the shoulders, shake them and shake them awake. We know it, we feel it, we observe it in our immediate environment. Paradoxically, aggressive activism that relies on a shock effect can rather promote a collective defensive attitude and indirectly contribute to mass displacement. How do we cope with the permanent crisis, with the threat of collapse? Not very well. No wonder that we all distract ourselves permanently, for example, with shopping or entertainment. depending on character or self-image, with the consumption of cat videos, news programs, cheap trash, or crash trash disguised as intellectual enlightenment. The whole range of modern addictions and substance dependencies is only hinted at here. Sorry. I lie on my bed. Outside the wind is blowing and it is raining. In the meantime, the redeeming rain has turned into a steady downpour. I look out of the small window in the bedroom at the tree tops moving in the wind, the rain dripping incessantly from the tiled roof as if it could be tears. I think about the misery of today's man and his being caught in all the muddle. However, the tragedy leaves me strangely untouched. This status quo has become too much of a habit for me too. Contempt and anger are mixed into my feelings. How much did the ignorance of the privileged people in the Western world and the social consequences of this ignorance cost me already? How much of joy of life and possibilities of development cost us all? Well, at least not life, like many other people who were not born with an EU passport. Meanwhile, the status quo, the life and the system we have come to terms with today, is imperceptibly and slowly taking on more and more bizarre features. A clear sign of cultural decline. I don't want to go into detail about all the shrill and decadent entertainment on TV and the internet. I'm talking about more about tangible, actually extreme effects of a system that is in decline. These effects are already so strongly embedded in our everyday life that we have accepted them as normal with a shrug of the shoulders. I'll list a few examples. Up to 40% of all white-collar jobs are now, in the self-perception of workers, so-called bullshit jobs. The continuous and slow expropriation of the middle class. Large corporations that pay no taxes. Corrupt politics that have become the norm. Wars on the fringes of the empire with hundreds of thousands of dead civilians. Targeted and unlawful drone killings have been the order of the day since Obama. The so-called war on terror, which is nothing but a pretextual legitimization to build a surveillance state and to justify the horrendous arms spending that stabilizes the US economy. A system-driven daily ecocide. The emergence of supranational structures of financial corporations and tech industries that are slowly but surely and in no way democratically legitimized, becoming more powerful than our nation states. An international debt that is now many times higher than the world's annual economic output. In other words, debts that can never be repaid. Money made with the help of money. A bloated financial system. Last but not least, a globally declared pandemic that encourages politicians inspired by authoritarian China to place billions of people worldwide under house arrest and to restrict their basic rights, including direct or indirect compulsory vaccination. Catastrophic collateral damage for the poorest people in the world, for women and children, is simply accepted as the only alternative. How dangerous or not this virus may be is not clarified conclusively yet. However, after 1.5 years, especially in the face of the hectic, defamatory and authoritarian actions of politics, the profiteering industry and their henchmen in the media, there are increasing signs that the fear and threat scenery can hardly be maintained any longer. The corona crisis, which has radically broken through our status quo, paradoxically, precisely in order to forcefully prolong the systemic status quo, is merely a symptom of the great systemic crisis of our time. How do I arrive at this assertion? First, because it is becoming increasingly clear that the pandemic was much ado about very little. Some countries are already rowing back and now classifying the disease as ordinary flu. The power struggle, however, has not yet been decided. We could be in for a long period of international repression, just like the pointless 20-year war in Afghanistan. Just as senseless as the war on terror, violence previously outsourced to the fringes of the rich Western world is now coming back to us. In the name of another invisible enemy, this time not the dangerous terrorist, but an invisible virus that is now supposed to terrify us, our basic rights are being rolled back and the surveillance state is slowly and surely being expanded. Again, of course, ostensibly for our own protection. This battle between freedom and repression will not be decided by individual actors, however, but by whether or not the game must inevitably be continued as a system-maintaining measure. That is one aspect. The other question that naturally arises is the following. Suppose this assessment were broadly correct, how can it be? Has the whole world gone mad? Have all the politicians in the world completely abandoned the good spirit? Have the media all fallen for the story? Or has there been the great world conspiracy? No. The world did not become paranoid and crazy in the course of the pandemic. It was already crazy long before. And my thesis is that we, the population, basically know that, but we repress it. We are afraid of collapse, of losing our privileges, our prosperity and our comforts, because we have no spiritual perspective that lifts us beyond mere material existence. Because we find no deeper meaning in life and therefore want to hold on to our prosperity by any means necessary. And that is why we cover for this policy, defending it in part with fervent zeal. Yes, we endorse this policy in elections, not despite the fact that politics is playing this game with increasingly aggressive methods, in part also against its own population, not despite the fact that it deliberately lets refugees drown in the Mediterranean, but because it does so. Because it does the dirty work for us, because it expands Fortress Europe and safeguards the status quo for us. All these signs of decline, which I listed earlier and which I will discuss with greater attention, have developed more and more strongly in recent decades and have crept into attention, have developed more and more strongly in recent decades and have crept into our reality. These destructive phenomena have continued to pile up until the moment when the accumulated partial problems and the moral decline of the system threatened to blow up the whole structure. This moment was already within reach before the corona crisis. It is beyond the scope here and beyond my own understanding to go into detail about why our financial system is at its end. But the fact that our financial system no longer works and that it is and it is one on the brink of collapse, is now a widely accepted consensus among many people and experts from very different directions and political camps. Anyone interested in this can find a wealth of information, articles, books, and TV documentaries from all areas of the media landscape, alternative as well as conventional mass media. All these documentaries go, at least as far as the description of the problem is concerned, in quite the same direction. The financial system has turned into a kind of pyramid game in the course of the decoupling from gold as an equivalent value and as a result of the deregulation of the last decades, which has to collapse sooner or later. Why? Money is created in two ways. First, by central banks simply printing money without any counter value and flushing it into the system, and by private banks making loans. When private banks do this, the system immediately creates exactly the amount of money that was made as a loan, completely independent of whether that loan is ever repaid or not. Then there are a lot of financial products that continue to speculate with this credit money and drive the amount of money further and further up and continue to create money out of thin air. Until the late 70s, the volume of money within the financial sector was pretty much congruent with the volume of money in the real economy worldwide. Because incredible amounts of money are shifted around in the derivatives and shadow banks that are not subject to control or reporting, there are only estimates of how large the volume of the entire financial sector has grown today. Some financial experts estimate that the volume of money in the entire financial sector is now 5 times larger than the total volume of money in the real economy. That is, there should actually be a huge inflation of money, because what is the value of this air money based on? And the second pillar of the value of money, namely the money that is created from lending, is also on shaky ground. The worldwide debts from the private and the public sector have grown today to a multiple of the worldwide gross national product. In other words, the majority of these debts can never be repaid. This should also be a reason for massive demonetization. Inflation and this fact were reflected in the system, but it is not yet. And why? Because all the speculators just keep on gambling as long as they somehow can. All of them hold on the illusion of the value of money, because all of them still make a lot of money out of it. About this and how dangerous the situation is for our whole system, there would be still very much to say, but I leave that to other people who have more idea about it. Now, there are people who say, oh, these prophets of disaster have been around for a long time. Things have always gone well somehow. Even the financial crisis of 2008 was somehow overcome. Yes, but only temporarily, because we have not solved any structural problems, but have only postponed the problem again with the help of massive financial injections from taxpayers. The analysis of the problem is very similar in all the various contributions and approaches. The question of how to solve the problem is answered very differently, depending on the political orientation. That is, of course, a completely different question, but that this fundamental problem exists in our financial system is pretty much consensus. I have yet to find a post anywhere that could plausibly show me otherwise. There are those who talk about the structural problems of the financial system, and there are those who simply ignore the problems and continue to pretend nothing is wrong. But I have yet to come across any passionate advocates of the financial system who could have explained why the system in itself will work in the long run and how this would serve the common good. At best, it is admitted that the system is very crisis prone and that money accumulates more and more at the top and gravitates towards the 0.001%. But there is no better or fairer system. In other words, the old chestnut of no alternative. This idea or this dogma today that there would be just no alternative is naturally wrong, because there has never been anything in the human history created by humans which lasted eternally. So why do we now collectively cling to this idea so unshakably and almost religiously? The quintessence of 20 years of Angela Merkel's reign can be reduced to this one idea: no alternative. Mrs. Merkel was elected again and again on the basis of a single election promise, which she had always kept: defending and preserving the status quo. How can it be that we all believe in this lack of alternatives? Even more, that we want to cling to it at all costs. One is the enormous propaganda apparatus that hammers this ideology into us in film, media, entertainment, infotainment, and politics. But that doesn't explain everything, because people are not so stupid that they don't realize they are being manipulated. No, we want to be manipulated. We want to keep believing in the system because we are afraid, and justifiably afraid, of collapse. That is why the increasingly urgent certainty of the impending collapse is collectively suppressed. Moreover, it is indeed the case that so-called real politics, such as the restrictive refugee policy, has no alternative if one wants to support and preserve our economic system at all costs. The fear of collapse is understandable and also justified, because we cannot know what will happen in the course of this once the avalanche is unleashed. Not everything will go smoothly and peacefully. From my point of view, however, this clinging to the status quo and the system is enormously dangerous, because the systemic problems will only be pushed further and further back and pile up higher and higher and continue to grow. Quietly the snow trickles. Peu à peu it continues to snow, until at some point the avalanche will be so big that it will no longer be able to be stopped, until it will crash into the valley with all the greater force and destructive power. We, the 99%, are located somewhere in this slope and valley. The 1% remain at the top and will be most able to protect themselves from the downfall. Yes, these people, of course, have the best information from the meteorologists who warn them of the inevitable downfall and tell them their forecasts. At the right time, this avalanche is then triggered with a targeted blast, as is also done in the Alps. And then it crashes once decently. It will catch us all more or less unprepared. The people who are at the top, of course, not. They will then specifically pull a rescue plan out of the drawer and present this plan to the frightened people. This plan, whatever it will look like, has first and foremost the task of securing the position of the people standing at the top, so that they can continue to stand at the top. And if there are then no other ideas that do not prolong the same form of domination, that cannot offer tangible alternatives on how we can create a society that is fair, equal, and free of exploitation, then the construction plan after the targeted demolition in the sense of the rulers will once again be accepted as without alternatives and shrugging. And that is why it is so important to break through this dogma, this paradigm of no alternative and to build today, right now, an alternative models to gather experience and to turn such alternatives into reality, to try out collective utopias, at least on a small scale. For some people, my avalanche comparison may sound like a conspiracy narrative about the evil elites. Maybe. But if you look at history, it has never been different than the ruling class at any given time wanted to preserve its power and do so at all costs and against the common good of the population. To understand the status quo, we need to understand the mechanics of power and the dynamics of evil. Time and again, we fall into the trap of evaluating certain personalities in positions of power as human beings based on our knowledge of human nature, which is grounded in our reality of the basically powerless. Then we find the spendy uncle in the sweater actually quite nice, or this powerful politician is actually quite sympathetic to us. He reminds us of the nice boss of our company, or the politician of our former religion teacher. We get struck on this personal level and all too easily overlook the function of these people within the system. The problem is more and more that this grown system serves only the interests of a smaller and smaller minority and threatens us all and our future on our planet existentially. Often politicians come rather from the middle class. They have to embody our cultural codes and be able to be sympathetic to us, to pass as which of us to be elected. These politicians serve themselves to the ruling class, in the process naturally benefiting from the connection as useful idiots for them. Widely known by now is the phenomenon of revolving doors, where politicians do politics in the interest of the big corporations for a while. After they leave politics again, they get into leading positions with exactly these corporations and earn a lot of money. This purely systemic function of politicians as useful idiots is a very important one, especially the more corrupt the whole system as such becomes. At the same time, I would like to qualify this function again insofar as the personal constitution and morality of an individual politician can, of course, still play a very large role, especially if that politician has a great deal of power as an individual. Therefore, it is, of course, also too short-sighted to say the politicians are all corrupt anyway, it doesn't matter who is currently at the top. Of course, this is also not true because there is a permanent struggle between good and evil, especially at the top of power, which sometimes turns out one way and sometimes another. One thinks, for example, of the Cuba crisis, where John F. Kennedy was surrounded by generals who favored the so-called first strike strategy. These generals urged JFK to be the first to attack the USSR with atomic bombs before it would do so, and it would then be too late to defend itself. The American president, as the supreme commander of the armed forces, has the last word on such decisions. Kennedy wanted to keep the peace at all costs, even as a devout Catholic, and took a great risk by this restrained action. As we know from history, his thoughtful action was correct and probably saved us from nuclear war. If any other person had been US president at that time, yielding to the whispers of the generals, it might have resulted in a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. But if we are already with JFK, to whom very probably his resistance against the military-industrial complex and the CIA had cost his life, at the time of the presidency of Kennedy, which ended 1963 with his assassination, one could still approve to a good part the system of that time as a whole, relatively, because even then the system had its own contradictions inscribed in its DNA, namely the logic of exploitation and the immeasurable greed of money. However, we know that at that time there were still contradictions due to the New Deal in Europe through the so-called post-war compromise. There was a functioning balance between capital and workers' interests, at least within their own national borders. Because this unprecedented success story, from whose upswing so many people across all strata profited, was even then only true for the citizens of the countries of the Western world. The other countries, mainly former colonial states, were mercilessly exploited even then. After the Second World War, and after the collapse of the British Empire, the US Empire began to expand its aggressive foreign policy more and more. This policy was not primarily driven by the elected representatives of the US democracy, but rather by the forces of the military and the intelligence services, which as henchmen of the US corporations in the world ruthlessly advanced the interests of these. In the countries of the Global South and the Middle East, also fueled by the Cold War, regime changes were carried out. Brute force was used by the US military and the CIA to impose their own policies on these countries and to ensure access to cheap resources for US corporations. All of this happened in secret and has had no democratic legitimacy from the American electorate. These structures, collectively called the deep state, are fundamentally anti-democratic and fascist. These powerful structures have slowly but surely developed and gained more and more influence in the United States after World War II. By the time of John F. Kennedy's presidency, an open power struggle had emerged between the president and the elected representatives of US democracy on the one hand, and the power of the intelligence agencies and the military-industrial complex on the other. The US was at a fork in the road. Should democratic politics succeed in forcing the militaristic mischief of a ruthless and amoral power politics back into Pandora's box, or should the military-industrial complex gain the upper hand? As we know today, this power struggle was decided with the assassination of John F. Kennedy in favor of the anti-democratic cluster of intelligence, military, and US big business. The assassination of John F. Kennedy, the last great US president with a backbone, was and is a tragedy for the entire world. Had Kennedy been able to prevail with his peace policy, it might have been possible to stabilize the balance between capital and the interests of workers in the long term, and to prevent the subjugation and exploitation of developing countries by the aggressive US foreign policy, which later resulted in free trade and globalization in favor of the interests of a handful of large corporations. It is speculation, and perhaps the decades of prosperity of the post-war compromise could not be sustained further, rather an anomaly within the logic of capitalism, because the power and greed of money inevitably prevails. Within a system that places the value of money at the center and above human dignity, and as a result inevitably submits to the power of mammon. This mammon is voracious and keeps on inflating. The fruits of evil are tempting, and some people, namely many of those who aspire to positions of power, succumb to them. Money, prestige, power, media attention, satisfaction of ambition and wealth. The attraction of the promises of power and its rewards is hard to comprehend for most people who are outside this gravitational field. Power corrupts, and there's an ongoing chain of evidence of this reality throughout human history. The problem with power is that when I'm in a position of leadership over people, especially when I don't even know them personally, I have a power of decision and disposal over them. In a complex, ambivalent world, my top-to-down decisions inevitably always have negative effects, at least on individuals. That is, in the best case, many or most people benefit from a decision, but I always also cause suffering for individuals. This is the case with every decision within a larger system, because our systems always generalize and can never keep the individual case in mind. But as a decision maker, I cannot connect with the suffering of those affected and truly empathize, because otherwise I would be incapable of action. I simply have to accept this suffering as collateral damage of my decision. That is, I need a lack of empathy. I have to cut off my ability to relate, at least from some of the people, in order to be able to fulfill my task. However, this innate or acquired lack of empathy is then simply there and is a nature that accompanies me. And with it, I am, under certain circumstances, in a position, out of a kind of pragmatic realism, to make decisions that under certain circumstances have catastrophic consequences for a great many people. We then simply shrug and accept these as real politics. Due to US peace missions, hundreds of thousands of civilians have been murdered in recent decades. Some estimates put the number at several million. It is usually unsympathetic but powerful real politicians and technocrats who make such decisions, knowing and accepting the consequences of these decisions. If I have cut off my empathy, however, I have also blocked the access to my own inner conscience, that I have no more conscience. One could call such people also sociopaths. Commonly one says then, for example, these would be politicians who take responsibility. In any case, they are people who often, without batting an eye, make decisions that cause immeasurable suffering. How is this possible? How can people be capable of doing that? Well, the basic prerequisite is said lack of empathy. And this is learned in such position of power, but mostly it is probably rather the case that people who, with an already pronounced lack of empathy, strive for positions of power. And this pre-existing lack of empathy is often rooted in early childhood trauma. Yes, there are even institutions within our system that systematically use the traumatization of children and young adults to train them to be leaders, such as military academies and particularly tough elite schools that rely on extreme discipline. Recently, scandals have emerged regularly where sports federations responsible for grooming top young athletes are implicated in systematic acts of sexualized violence, sometimes over decades. These assaults do not just happen, for example, because there is a hierarchical dependency on the coach. This is also the case in a normal school between teachers and students. No, it is about targeted traumatization and about the fact that even children learn through this to display a maximum lack of empathy, namely, in this case, against themselves and their own bodies. It is precisely through the mental pain and the splitting off of one's own bodily sensations that the basis is laid for the willingness and ability to train excessively despite great physical pain, and to be able to muster an excess of ambition as an escape from the mental pain. It is a perfidious game, which probably no successful trainer has planned from the beginning, but which proves to be highly effective in terms of sporting success. And from the lack of empathy and the suppressed feelings, sometimes a direct path leads to acts of evil. Trauma shuts down our ability to feel, drastically limiting our emotional life and empathy. The feelings that we are now unable to perceive are not simply gone, however, but are pushed away into the unconscious. Our emotions henceforth elude our grasp, clump together in the subconscious and develop a life of their own and a momentum of their own that remains hidden from us. However, through the cracks of this wall that we have erected around our souls as self-protection, these unresolved, diffuse sensations push out, condense, and drive us to irrational, often destructive and self-destructive actions. People who have directly experienced or witnessed acts of violence often compartmentalize them. However, the shock and experience of radical evil remains alive in them. If we look back into European history, marked by countless wars, virtually every generation has had to relive and live through this experience of violence, with the exception of the generations in Central Europe today, those people born after 1945. This long period of peace in our latitudes has been a great blessing for the people in this country. However, there is a problem, namely the deceptive certainty and normality of peace, or rather the absence of violence and war. Because of this, we all hardly underestimate and understand anymore the power of evil, the devil's grip on man, especially on traumatized men. The intelligent strategy of the devil today is that he has made himself invisible. In this way, we are hardly aware of evil, naively trust the powerful of this world, continue to push the game of our system to the extreme, and move towards the greatest catastrophe in human history, the destruction of our planet, our own livelihoods. The unvarnished recognition of the abyss belongs to the spiritual awakening just as much as the groping of the real possibility to be able to attain paradise on earth. Thank you. So I'm going to check out if somebody's asking a question. You can do so by writing into the chat comments, but of course you can also write something later afterwards, and I'm going to comment it in a written form. I know that it might be a bit difficult to follow all these different complex ideas, and probably also my translation is not the best one, so maybe there's also some misunderstandings due to poor translation. That is very much possible. However, I'm going to publish the text also as a blog in Substack, and then you have all the articles in the written form, which might make it more easy to understand and follow my ideas and develop your own ideas which you want to write into the comment section, which I highly want to motivate to do so. In any way, next week I'm going to change the schedule, reading always on Wednesdays, not on Fridays, on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Middle European time. So just that you know. And for today I say goodbye and see you next week. Thank you.